It's time to get into one of the most talked about topics in all of wrestling, the Montreal Screwjob. Everybody has weighed in on this, given their opinion, written books, done interviews. Everybody's talked about this, except for me. So now it's time for me to do a legal breakdown of the Montreal Screwjob. So before we get into everything, there's 3 key points I need everybody to understand. Now, here's the timeline. In October 1996, Bret signs a 20-year WWF contract worth about $15 to $20 million total value. Now, this contract includes a clause that says reasonable creative control. Interesting. Now, in mid to late 1997, while Bret is still champion, Vince informs Bret that he intends to void the contract, right? And he offers to broker him a deal to sign with WCW. Now, November 9th, 1997, the Montreal Screwjob happens. So let's talk about this clause, reasonable creative control. Now, I certainly didn't have one of these clauses in my contract. Otherwise, I would have been champion multiple times over. I would have wanted all kind of creative control of my storyline. But anyway, what's reasonable? What's considered reasonable? Like, what could Bret do with this clause? Did he determine, whether he was a champion? Did he determine finishes of matches? Could he determine storylines? Or could he void those? If he didn't like the present storyline, could he change it? Could he change the finish? All of these are great questions that I would like to know. But from what I can tell, this contract was in there just as it is. From what I can tell, this clause was in there just as it is, and it was intentionally left very, very vague. So what would be considered reasonable? Let's take a look at how this works in Hollywood. So let's say that I get a role in a film with Sylvester Stallone, and I have reasonable creative control in my contract. So I decide I want to be a badass in this film. I want to look great. I want to beat everybody up. I don't want to lose any fights. I want to have the best one-liners, sound bites. I want to be the hero who's still standing at the end, right? Can I do all that? But then what happens if I lose reasonable creative control? What if Sylvester Stallone tells me, hey, there's been a rewrite and now you're not a badass, but you're the butt of every joke. Yeah, you're the goofy guy everybody slaps around and makes fun of. All the jokes are aimed at you, and basically, I'm a doormat. Well, I'm not going for that, but that's what could happen in Hollywood. I would have no control. I would just be an actor. And usually, this is the case for most actors until you get enough clout where you can have a clause like this with reasonable creative control. But usually, you just have to go along with whatever the writers say. Here's an example of something that could be unreasonable. What happens if in the story, my character is supposed to die and be written out? And I say, not so fast. I want to be the main character. I want to be the last man standing at the end. Clearly, they're not going to let me do that. That would be completely unreasonable. If your character's got to go, he's got to go. All right, so let's talk about what reasonable creative control could mean for Bret Hart in his contract. Now, I would imagine this could be something like, let's say Bret didn't want to be in the middle of the card. Let's say he wanted to be the main event. Okay, they might let him do that. Let's say he wanted a 2-segment match instead of a 1-segment match. Okay, they might let him do that. Let's say Bret had a crazy idea and he wanted to do a 60-minute Broadway and take up an entire hour. Now, I don't think they would let him do that. That seems pretty unreasonable to me. So where do you draw the line between what's reasonable and what's not? Because there's a lot of things that fall in between those. So in mid to late 1997, Vince McMahon comes to Bret Hart and tells him that he won't be able to honor his contract moving forward. Now, it's at this very moment, that's something called anticipatory breach of contract, which means at that very moment, at the very moment that Vince said those words, the contract is technically void, which means Bret should have gone to his attorney, and at that point, his attorney could have reached out to Vince McMahon and negotiated some type of exit, or tried to take him to court and sue for specific performance or create some kind of a settlement so Bret could be paid. But if I was his attorney, I definitely would have negotiated some kind of an exit, tried to get him paid and get him over to WCW, but some way to wrap up the contract legally so there wasn't so much ambiguity, and to maintain as much of Bret's goodwill and IP that we could. So the fact that Vince verbally told Bret he couldn't honor the contract, that's anticipatory breach, but it's verbal. Now, if Bret had gone to his lawyer immediately, and let's say I was his lawyer, I would have said, we need something in writing immediately. I would have reached out to WWE, Vince McMahon, and got something in writing, because otherwise we're kind of in this gray area. The contract is essentially void, but I can't let my client go out there and still wrestle where we don't exactly know what the rules are, what things can happen. Do we even still have creative control? It's just too much to be left to chance, but you definitely want something in writing, because this verbal statement just kind of bothers me, because it's almost one guy's word against the others. So once Vince told Bret that he couldn't honor the contract, it's essentially void. And as far as I'm aware of, there was no separation agreement or any tentative agreement as to how they were going to operate until there was a resolution. So it seemed that everything was just going off of good faith and trusting one another, which can be dangerous in business. So in 1997, Bret signs with WCW. And this is important because now this demonstrates a breach of contract. So if you go back to the verbal, when Vince told Bret he couldn't honor the contract, that was a breach. But again, this is just verbal between two people. But now we have an action of Bret talking to WCW, signing with them. That is indeed a breach. So that validates whatever conversation Vince and Bret had, that Vince told him he couldn't honor the contract. This is proof that Bret was acting on the anticipatory breach, by Vince McMahon's words. So the fact that the contract had already been breached by November 9th, 1997, the date of the Montreal Screwjob, brings into a big question. Did Bret still have creative control on that night? Because remember, Vince had already breached the contract through anticipatory breach by telling Bret he couldn't honor it, and then Bret breached it further by talking to WCW and eventually signing with them. So now, doesn't this invalidate the terms of creative control? Because I would argue that by the contract, technically, Bret no longer has creative control on November 9th, 1997. So although he did not want to drop the title to Shawn Michaels, and in Canada, he didn't really have a say-so. And there was nothing he could fall back on in his contract because it was breached and essentially void on that night. Now, I understand this may not be a popular opinion because, you know, what Vince McMahon did to Bret Hart personally that night was really shady. And morally, I mean, yeah, that was something. He backstabbed him. But from a legal standpoint, technically Vince didn't do anything wrong. Technically, WWE did not violate any terms by this. There was no creative control and the contract was void. So any argument of the creative control clause, reasonable or otherwise, is out the window. I'm sorry. It would have been different if the contract hadn't been voided and Bret still had creative control, reasonable creative control. That would have given him a leg to stand on in negotiating and or if this went to court. But the fact that the contract was void, I'm sorry, but he doesn't have creative control. He didn't have it on that night. Now, I love Bret Hart. I got to say this. He's one of my favorite people that I ever met. He was one of my wrestlers I looked up to growing up. I got to work with him. I've gotten to know him. I love Bret. One thing about Bret is he is one of the nicest people, but he loves wrestling. He's just a pure wrestler. Now, I think that he trusted Vince and WWE a little bit too much with good faith. And, Bret always just, could rely on his wrestling. However, when it comes to business, you need a shark to deal with other sharks. Personally, I don't agree with what Vince did, but legally, he wasn't necessarily in the wrong. Because if you go back to that time, in 1997, Vince told Bret that he couldn't honor the contract or he couldn't pay him. I don't know if I believe that. I don't know if Vince was being honest there or not, because just 2 years later, they went public with an IPO. So I think more likely what happened is Vince knew that he couldn't have this giant contract hanging over while they were trying to go public. And I think that's what happened. He just didn't want to tell that to Bret. All right. So in the comments, I want you guys to let me know. Do you agree with me or disagree with me, either personally or legally? And also, I want to say this too. I'm just going off of the facts that I presented to you, the facts that I was given. I don't know if there's more information here. I don't know if there was actually a separation agreement between the time when Vince told Bret he couldn't honor the contract and then up to the Montreal Screwjob, because that would change things drastically. So if anybody has any information on this, please reach out to me. Let me know. Bret Hart, hey, I would love to talk to you, and I would love to get your story on this, because I'm sure there's a ton I don't know, and that could likely change my opinion on this. So please feel free to reach out. Let me know.